My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Mind you, I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Horra, and my audience does too. Kalima Horra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking about Palestine and asking the questions: have the Western masses awoken to the reality of Palestine occupation? Well, on one level, they'd have to be brain dead if they haven't. If seeing hundreds of thousands of people, 2.2 million in total, literally under relentless bombardment, being killed, maimed, slaughtered, displaced, sent fleeing for their lives, watching hospitals being bombed, watching white phosphorus raining down on a civilian population with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. When Netanyahu ordered the Palestinian people to leave because a massive bombardment was about to begin, the question that ought to have been on everybody's lips was: leave to where? How to leave? And of course, we now know, into this mass murder operation, we now know that there was no safe place anywhere in the Gaza Strip. In the case of the Israeli exits, of course, no exit for Palestinians. In case of the Egyptian exit, well, only if Israel allows it, and only if Israel doesn't bomb the people actually exiting from it. The grotesque over-identification of Western governments and Western mass media with this genocidal carnage is pregnant with many, many problems for the political class, for the media class, and sadly for the whole society in Western countries. One could hardly blame any Arab, any Muslim, anywhere for believing that their Western country in which they are living is every bit as guilty and complicit in this mass murder of the Palestinians as Benjamin Netanyahu. After all, they are all singing from the same hymn sheet. And some of them, the worst recidivist offenders, the United States and the United Kingdom, are literally sending armed forces to the shores of the Levant. And the possibility of American aircraft carriers either beginning an attack on people in Palestine, in Lebanon, in Syria, or, and I invite you to imagine this, because frankly, an aircraft carrier is rather a sitting target. Those very same British and American warships being successfully attacked from the shores of the Mediterranean, alongside which they now sit, are very real possibilities. And like a series of Russian dolls, Palestine is inside the Lebanese resistance, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is inside the axis of resistance involving Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and of course the biggest of all, inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. You can easily see how Western public and the Western governments could very quickly find themselves drawn into a vortex of violence, even possibly existential violence because, if you like, overarching even the Islamic Republic of Iran is their relationship with both Russia and China. It's not fanciful to say that this local war in Gaza can become a regional war and can become even bigger than a regional war. I think the Western masses are having to wake up to something else, which is that their democracy itself is a figment of their imagination. The British government called police commanders to London, in the midst of a crime wave in Britain, by the way, to lecture the police commanders about the need to arrest people for holding Palestinian flags and wearing certain articles of clothing, presumably the keffiyeh. Well, they'll need to build a lot of new prisons in Britain, and they'll need to recruit an awful lot of new police officers if you're going to start arresting people for wearing the keffiyeh, because, as far as I can see, half of London is wearing it just this very day. As always, I'm joined by a distinguished group of experts, the first of whom is Dr. Ghada Karmi, a Palestinian doctor, a research fellow at the University of Exeter, an author, a broadcaster, and above all, an activist. Dr. Ghada, you were born in Jerusalem. You were driven out of your country. You've been in exile ever since. I know that the Arab audience of this show won't need you to say this, but for all the others that will be watching this show, how does it feel to be a Palestinian watching what we're watching right now?
Well, I'm appalled. There isn't any other way that I can put it. I'm appalled by the attitude of the country in which I live. And as you pointed out, this is a country where my family took refuge in 1948 because of the establishment of the State of Israel. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We would be in my homeland, Palestine. I'm always struck by the way that Britain has been so treacherous to the Palestinians. You know, this goes back a long way, and this is not the time or the place to do a history lecture, but very briefly, people must remember that Israel would never have existed had it not been for Britain. Britain created Israel, and having created it in 1948, they looked at what they had created, they looked at the mayhem and the war and the violence, and they walked out. And I really also want to interject a personal note about this. You see, I don't have much doubt that Israel is planning for what I suppose we Palestinians would call a second Nakba. They are planning for an operation of ethnic cleansing. I don't see any other way to explain their actions in Gaza and their actions in the West Bank. Now, what is all this about? It seems to me that this is about ethnic cleansing, getting rid of the Palestinians who live in Gaza, getting rid of the Palestinians who live in the West Bank. This, for me, stirs up really painful memories of the first ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, which I lived through 1948. Now, I was a child, but I will never forget the trauma, the fear, the anxiety, the sense of hopelessness of leaving my homeland, living in somewhere completely foreign, completely new, and with the knowledge unfolding, not at the time, but as I started to grow up, that we were never going to be allowed back. So to see this beginning to happen again to Palestinians, again, after 75 years, is not only unacceptable, I cannot adequately express my horror, my outrage, and my rejection of any such fate for the Palestinians.
Well, none of us can do it adequately, but you have done it most eloquently. Jonathan Chadwick, a signatory of Artists for Palestine UK pledge, director of As Theatre, sometime teacher at the London Film School. It's painful for us, you and I, as British people, to hear that, isn't it? Our role in the creation of this tragedy. And it's also kind of biblical, you know, the idea of driving the Palestinians onto some exodus in the desert has so many biblical amplifications that these are quite extraordinary times that we're living through, and our country then and now is right at the center of it, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true that you have to look at the language of symbols and the language of mythology and the way in which the arguments are built up on the basis of synergies between the regime here and the Israeli regime. What I mean by that is that these regimes are kin in terms of the kind of social organizations of which they represent. And then I think from there we can begin to see that Israel is an outpost of European imperialism in the Middle East. And we can see that European imperialism itself is, in its modernity producing project, a genocidal movement. And you can reflect back on the history of that imperialist project, and you can see that genocide coming up again and again and again against indigenous people throughout the globe. So I'm not saying it's no surprise what's happening. I'm simply, and I of course, by talking about it even, one might appear to be justifying it, but I'm saying you do have to look very deep into the integuments of the English-British regime and look at the settler colonial basic heritage of the English regime. After all, it was in the end of the 13th century, and I think you're right, we don't want a history lesson, but it is important to go back into the history and look at what was going on. The first settler colonial project in this country was practiced on the Welsh people, and you can still see the settlements. The castles that are built in Wales were those implantations by the English regime when they put in English farmers to farm the land of Wales. So that settler colonialism is deep in the sense of the regime that we exist in and that we've been brought up in. So when we're talking about these reactions from the state and these pronouncements from the state, they belong in that area of the world, which is to do with symbolic language. So, you know, if you're looking at what actually holds together the Israeli project, there is nothing other than genocide that holds it together. The Israelis are in the grip. They cannot break the grip of that need to continue their project through genocide, through the destruction and effacement of the Palestinian people. So I think that one's got to recognize that it's the nature and character of the Israeli state, but not just that, the nature and character of Western imperialism that one is actually having to talk about. And if anything, what we're in a position now historically is that we can, as I think you were pointing out, George, we can start to look at this social phenomenon of the West, and we can see that it's in and beginning to be in its last days. It's breaking up as a civilizational project. And one of the signs of that, of course, is this enactment in the Holy Land, in Palestine, of the Israeli state as a kind of subaltern substitute European imperialist project within the Middle East.
Youssef Al-Helou, journalist, correspondent, political analyst from Gaza. It's less than 100 miles from Armageddon to Gaza. I looked it up just before the show. Megiddo is 110 kilometers from Gaza. Are we making, I've made that journey. Are we all going to make that journey in the opposite direction? Does Gaza lead to Armageddon? Do the Palestinians agree to go into the Sinai desert and live there waiting for what an Israeli leader said, for the international community to build cities for them? Or are they going to stay put?
Well, George, I was in Gaza last month and with my family, and we anticipated that the Israelis might attack Gaza without any pretext. So the idea of Israel waging an offensive and onslaught in Gaza was there all the time. We successfully made it safe back to London. Gaza has been always headache to Israel because it is described as the capital of resistance. And because of the steadfastness for people under Israel's crippling blockade for the past 16 years, that was something wasn't explained to Israelis, that the more you pressure people, the more they become resisting to those collective punishment policies. Now, I don't think the Palestinians of Gaza would agree or would accept the idea of becoming refugees again and be pushed towards the Sinai Peninsula, for the simple reason that 2/3 of Gaza population originally are descendants of refugees. And they say there is no guarantee if we go back, if we go to Egypt or Sinai, that Israel would allow them to go back if Israel decides to invade
Well, there's a guarantee
Gaza.
that they wouldn't.
Yeah, well, but my family, they refused to leave the house despite the leaflets dropped from the air. They say we would rather die in our house. The people of Gaza are dismayed by the apathy of the so-called international community due to the lack of action of the international community. They are left alone to face their fate. Unfortunately, it seems that Palestinians are being dehumanized. It seems that Palestinian blood has no value to the Western societies. No place safe in Gaza. Hospitals were bombarded, clinics, mosques, universities. Everything is a target. Israel does not need a justification to attack Palestinians. Simple as that.
Let's hear from New York, from Rabbi Visroel David Weiss, with whom, if I'm not mistaken, I once traveled into Gaza. Rabbi, what are the root causes of the current conflict between Israel and Gaza?
With the help of the Almighty, I pray to the Almighty to bestow upon me His truth and wisdom, that I may convey His message and so sanctify His name, inshallah, bring peace to the world. The root cause is clearly because of the introduction of a political ideology called Zionism. It's a nationalist movement. It's masquerading in a religious name, Israel and the Star of David and so forth, but it is a totally flawed, a material movement, selfish people who wanted to create their own haven, their own sovereignty, and they're using the religion to create it. That is the root cause of so much hate, strife, bloodshed, and rift between Jews and Muslims. And it's very clear, it's not an opinion, our history attests that Jews and Muslims lived together in harmony for hundreds and hundreds of years in every Arab and Muslim land, clearly identified as religious Jews amongst clearly Muslim people, and there were no human rights groups or necessary or United Nations, whether it was in Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, Iran. We lived together. I bring a lot of times pictures with me. We have pictures. I always like to show how we lived together as brothers. We were able to live our lives together. We babysat each other's children. This is the way Jews were prior to the introduction of Zionism.
Recently, the Palestinian flag, even the kafia, has been said by the authorities and their apologists to be equated with terrorism, even anti-Semitism. Is the Palestinian flag really anti-Semitic?
God forbid. A Palestinian flag is the flag of the people of Palestine, the indigenous populace, who have a flag, as all over the world people have flags to represent themselves. The flag of Palestine would actually be the flag of the Muslims, Christians, and Jews, and we would be continually developing and growing and flourishing.
You lost your grandparents, many of your relatives in the Holocaust. How do you feel about Israel using the Holocaust as justification for what they are doing now?
That is just like the Nakba, this terrible catastrophe of this occupation, has many links to this sorrowful chain that's called the Nakba. The killing of Palestinians, the abuse of all the Palestinian people, the abuse of the Jewish people, that they murder and assassinated Jewish rabbis, that they beat and so forth, that we'll get into later. At the same time, they breach the laws of the Torah, and they use different ploys to legitimize their occupation. They use anti-Semitism, as we've spoken of before, and they use the Holocaust, where we, still living and breathing, thank God, we remember my grandparents, my aunts and uncles, my first cousins, because I'm over 60, I had first cousins who were murdered by the Nazis, both from Poland and from Hungary. And the vast majority of all our communities died. And they died, why? Because we are Jews, and we are subservient to God, and we want to uphold our religion, our Judaism. Now, and we were ready to die for that. There were Jews who were ready, didn't want to give their children to Christian homes. They said, rather we die because this is our life, is to serve God according to our religion. Now the Zionists come, and they want to, for their convenience, in order to intimidate others, to silence anybody to speak up against them, they take this suffering of the Holocaust that were just recently, the blood is still fresh, we died, millions of people. They take this issue and use it as a tool to further their occupation, their crime.
There are increasing numbers of demonstrations, manifestations of all kinds of support for the Palestinian people, but the authorities and their mouthpieces brand these as expressions of support for terrorism, for anti-Semitism. Is that going to work?
For many years, tens of years, the Zionists enjoyed the control of the microphone, and they put pressure on the media that they should give the narrative like they want to say, that it's anti-Semitic, and whoever opposes them, and that they're the voice of Judaism, and that it was a land without a people, and for a people without a land, that and the only reason that people are objecting to them being there is because it was an empty land, and there's just people who are anti-Semitic and Palestinians, and coming running around looking to bother the Jews. Not that we took their homes or their towns. They ignored all of the true history, and they had control of the mic. Today we have so many different opportunities of alternative media that the world should be aware of what's happening. Therefore, I think that most people in the world look for justice and have compassion.
How long can Israel go on doing this, and what should the so-called international community be doing about it?
Well, let me just add, again, we plead with the world that at the doors, the gates of Gaza, they're standing now, amassed, the Israeli army, 300,000. And so we plead with the world, recognize, have respect for the Jewish authorities around the world, true to Judaism, and do not commit this colossal crime. Do not murder the victims, the Palestinian people. It's enough for these last 75 years, and the Jewish blood that kept on pouring, all because of Zionism. Don't be fooled by Zionism. Don't invade the people of Gaza. Instead, look at the true solution, which is removal of the true impediment to peace, which is this illegal, illegitimate, and selfish occupation, which stopped our coexistence of peace. And that, God should help, it should happen sooner nowadays.
I'll be back with the second part right after this short break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen television, coming from London, but talking, of course, about Palestine, about Gaza. Jonathan Chadwick, when the rabbi was talking, you were making the point that, of course, the origin of this Zionism is not there, but here in the West.
Absolutely. It's not. It was actually something that the Jewish people only took up latterly. I think that the birth of the idea of Zionism was very much within the Protestant ideologies that moved out of our civil war. But when you consider even the phrase that the rabbi used about a land without a people for a people without a land, that's not Golda Meir. That is Alexander Keith in 1843 publishing a book that was couched in the fantasy idea of the Israeli state. I just think it's really important to see how the depth of these ideas are in the British state and that's the level of our responsibility. You might, I think you were right to say, well, let's look at what that means in terms of what's happening at the moment within the British people. I think that there is a movement of sentiment towards the Palestinian people. But I think at the moment that process of the movement of our political ideas and the way that we want to organize our society have got to go a lot further than just simple sympathy with the Palestinian people. I think that is the gateway towards a larger movement where we can start to reconstruct our society.
Yeah, thoughts and prayers every 2 or 3 years when there's a massacre going on just isn't any longer, indeed never was, enough. Dr. Ghada, the Conservative in Britain, the Liberals in the United States, in the White House, the Democrats, they're all interchangeable, aren't they? You and I were members of the miscalled Labour Party for a long time. But actually, the position of the Labour Party is as bad, if not worse, actually, than that of the Conservatives. Ditto in the US, the Republicans and the Democrats, and even Robert F. Kennedy Jr. are all identical. It's absolutely monolithic. How do the public alter that?
It's difficult. I think I referred earlier to the fact that in my lifetime, let's say, I saw the growth of pro-Palestinian support amongst ordinary people, which has been ongoing and has increased every year. And we can feel it and know it today. However, we do need to recognize that it's very difficult for ordinary people to move very much on this issue. And the reason is that the Zionists have always been ahead in the propaganda game. And we must not ignore the effect of that on not only ordinary people, but mass media, politicians, and so on. It's very powerful. And if we remember, if we look back, the Zionists always paid a lot of attention to what I would call the framing of this story. So right from the beginning, from the end of the 19th century, they were well aware that the idea of going to a small country in the Middle East and trying to make that into the state of Jews was going to be virtually impossible. So what did they do? They framed it in terms of the Bible, the Old Testament, a people coming home, this kind of thing. They worked very hard on it.
Even though they were all atheists, in fact.
They were themselves, exactly, they were themselves atheists, but they were perfectly cynical and clever about using that sort of religious language and symbolism in order to sell the idea, which is what Zionism has always been about, marketing, really. Israel has been marketed. That's the truth of it. So at that time, that was the game, you know, people who are only coming home and had all been dispersed all around the world, this story. And that really worked. And then when the Holocaust happened, the framing became that Palestine was the only place that Jews would be safe in. They could not have another Holocaust in their own ancestral homeland idea. So that framing took over. And then when we got the '67 war, the next lot of framing was, oh, we're so threatened by these Arabs and they were going to invade us and kill us and all the rest of it. And everybody needs to help David against Goliath, that kind of idea, and so, and on and on. So what I'm trying to say is the framing as far as the current events are concerned has been crucial in the success so far of Israel. They have spent years framing the idea that Gaza is full of either terrorists or would-be terrorists, and in a sense, therefore, what you do with them is justified. And that one must not underestimate this idea. People have actually bought it. So I'm coming back to your question. How far can ordinary people, the masses, go in trying to understand what's going on? I'm trying to say that they're limited by the power of this extraordinary propaganda. That's how, you know, if you dehumanize people, if you equate them with terrorists or human animals.
Human animals, yeah.
Yeah. Now, so it is, in a sense, you can understand it. If you bomb them, if you destroy them, if you kill them, annihilate their neighbors. This is kind of a sense in which, well, this is only to be expected.
Now, let's get a European perspective from Amsterdam, in fact, and in the Netherlands. Dr. Anne de Jong, Associate Professor of the Anthropology of Conflict, with a regional expertise on the Middle East. Dr. de Jong, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Doctor, are there indications of a shift in public opinion in Western countries towards Palestine?
Well, it's very important to differentiate between two Western realms. On the one hand, there is the political realm, which we've seen is quite straightforward and united in their response. They call it terrorism. Israel's the right to defend itself. But on the more popular voice that you hear in Western countries such as the United States, but also the United Kingdom and the Netherlands, is much more interesting from a scientific perspective and much more differentiated. Where the political realm really focuses on social, economic, and political interest, the people in the last 10, 15 years have been taken in a lot of different information. For example, they watch social media, but also many years of activism have changed the perception of what's going on in Israel and Palestine to focus much more on human rights rather than a very crude binary distinction, either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine.
You've recently completed an 18-month piece of research into the situation in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in Gaza for that matter. Can you give us the overview of your findings?
There's my research focused on human rights activism. One thing I should mention from the onset is that this does not mean that while I focus on nonviolent resistance, that there is a sharp break between nonviolent and violent resistance. It's both part of the Palestinian liberation movement. And second, I want to emphasize that it's very interesting to see that already since my research started around 2007, 2008, you see a shift towards unity between different ways and different groups of resistance. So where before there was a Palestinian armed faction, Palestinian popular resistance against, for example, the separation wall, and now you see that while they all have their different ways and even different perceptions of what the solution in the end should be, they're uniting together and not instead of competition, working in their own territories and in their own ways, furthering towards justice.
Plainly, Israel's actions are illegal under international law, the Geneva Conventions, the rules of war established at the Nuremberg tribunals at the end of the Second World War, and so on. Why do Western governments simply ignore such fundamental points?
Yeah, that's moving back to the political realm and the political reactions. It is very important to say that these are politicians, spokesperson, members of parliament, who each have their own context in which they operate. And they really prioritize political and socio-economical interest in the region, but also in their home countries. For example, in the United States, there has been a long history of support for Israel. One should not underestimate that there is a huge elective population who are Zionist Christians, so who deeply believe and are embedded in what's going on in Israel from a religious perspective. If you look at the UK and the politicians who respond there, they come from a slightly different background because the United Kingdom has been directly involved in the establishment of the situation as it is now, most notably due to the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which promised part of mandate Palestine to the Zionist movement. And here you can see that it is constantly conflated with anti-Semitism. However, in the UK, you see that this is often conflated with legitimate critique on the state of Israel. And that makes it very hard for politicians to even dare to criticize Israel because they will be accused of anti-Semitism in the UK.
Of course, Ukrainians resisting Russian occupation are freedom fighters. Palestinians resisting Israeli occupation are terrorists. In the Second World War, I was born just 9 years after the Second World War. I grew up believing that the French resistance were heroes, but to the German occupiers of France, they were, of course, terrorists. This kind of labeling, how does it help or hinder any proper understanding of the situation?
Yeah, I think the first thing we need to consider when answering this question is that there's has been a construction of a very crude binary distinction. So Palestine on the one hand, Israel on the other, and you have to choose. If that is the case, and given the history of many European countries and the history of the relationship between the US and Israel, it is the safe bet and also the historical continuation to be pro-Israel, either whether it's based on a wrong sense of guilt, and on the other hand, it is a crude distinction that leaves no space for the human rights, the political rights, the socioeconomic rights of the other. So if you say that they are terrorists, if you emphasize the right to military intervention, you do not have to deal with the fact that the everyday situation in Palestine is one of military occupation.
Well, what will be the end result of all of this? The Western governments giving more and more extreme support and license to Netanyahu's government, whilst more and more of their public opinion is beginning to see things more clearly and very differently. What kind of outcome might there be of this?
Well, first, I'm a scientist, so I'm of course specialized in what is and not particularly on what will be in the future. But I can say that my current research and the broader perspective has two sides. On the one hand, I have very little hope for the next couple of weeks and next couple of months. On the other hand, however, I think it is significant that people spread different information, that people dare to speak up against their own governments, against biased or single-handed reporting in their own countries, that they're spreading and moving to the streets. And this is not limited to Arab countries, but we're talking also New York, London, The Hague here in the Netherlands. I think the particularly hopeful here is the involvement of many young people, so students, and the very vocal and very strongly represented part of the Jewish diaspora. So Jewish citizens of these countries who very clearly speak out and say, hey, not in my name. I refuse to be made into an enemy, and I refuse to any longer go on with the narrative that costs so many people's life.
Yusuf, in the swirl of all these events, it's easy to lose perspective and indeed to lose hope. In my lifetime, Algeria was a département of France, and 1.5 million French people lived there and were going to remain there forever. French Algeria was a reality that would never change, no matter how many Algerian martyrs there were, no matter how much struggle for independence there was. How do you, as a person from Gaza, here in exile, how do you keep the faith, as it were, the belief that that you're walking through this storm, but you'll never walk alone?
Well, George, I didn't ask to be a Palestinian. I just got lucky. So seeing the Palestinian flag waved all over the world makes me happy that it is a central issue. Actually, I would like to see the Palestinian flag and the kufiya, the symbol of freedom and peace. It's ironic that the world is turning a blind eye to the issue of Palestine as if Palestinians are the aggressors. We will not vanish like Native Americans. We will stay there. We teach the love and history of our homeland to our kids and generations to come. Probably Palestine is the only country still colonized under military occupation worldwide. That's why there is solidarity and sympathy from people around the world, because when an oppressed nation, they are being subjected to this cruel hegemony, Americans, West, everybody's fighting the Palestinians simply because they are seeking freedom. So we believe that this is a just cause, and Palestinians will never raise the white flag. We know that colonizers will leave. That's why we have this vision, we have this belief that whatever Israel does to the Palestinians, Palestinians will continue fighting. Palestinians use different methods, peaceful resistance, armed struggle. We were let down by the international community, the United Nations, Security Council. So Palestine one day will be free.
Dr. Ghada, Arafat used to say to me all the time, we are not the Red Indians. And I put that out on social media a week or so ago and got banned. It got banned because it was offensive to the Native Americans, calling them Red Indians. Arafat was before the new political correctness. But it is true, isn't it, that the Palestinians have refused to go into the museum. And that's what really sticks in the throat of the empire.
Absolutely. And you know, actually, if you look at it from the Israeli point of view, from the Zionist point of view, the big mistake that in 1948 the Zionists didn't expel all the inhabitants, the Arab inhabitants of Palestine, and many of them have actually said it. That's one problem they have, that is, there are people, Palestinians, still in the homeland. But of course, the other issue which they didn't take account of was that there is a wider Arab world beyond Palestine. Now, even though many of us are in despair about the attitude of Arab governments, we know that there is a tremendous amount of support and sympathy amongst ordinary Arabs in different Arab countries. That depth, if you like, to the Palestinians is also very important, which the Zionists cannot defeat. Israel at the moment is very adept at bashing and killing and destroying and expelling, but it has no end plan. So in other words, we don't know, no matter how this plays out, what's going to be done next, who has a plan for the future. And the point I wanted to make is it's wonderful, really, and admirable that the Hamas fighters exploded this whole rotten structure, which is based on brute force, propaganda, Western compliance, Arab weakness. It's all these aspects are necessary to keep the thing going. In that operation, Hamas, whatever else you wanted to say about it, has exploded all of it. It's all come tumbling down. So the question now is, okay, when the so-called dust has settled, when all the killing has stopped, and what next? A return to the status quo is not on the cards. So what else?
All is changed, isn't it, Jonathan Chadwick? Changed utterly. The notions of Israeli impregnability, military intelligence superiority, the Arab governments being able to, over the heads of their people, normalize their relations with Israel, and the Western governments backing of Israel is now out in the open. All is really changed.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I absolutely support and agree with what Ghada has said about this extraordinary move that the Hamas fighters made into Israel, actually puncturing the invincibility of the Israeli state. What's been so impressive about the history of the Palestinian people is their extraordinary inventiveness, their perseverance, and to some extent, their ability to adapt to the circumstances in which they've been thrown. So my feeling is very much on the positive that Yosef has said and that Ghada has said. And that is absolutely my view as well. And without doubt, the meaning of Intifada is that everybody can do something. Everybody, there are different forms of struggle, and that invention of a social movement where that is the case, which we saw in 1987, is of world historical importance. So yes, I feel that movement is going to go on. Whether a terrible beauty is going to be born, George, which is the completion of the Yeats quote from Easter 1916, that great poem that Yeats wrote, that terrible beauty, I think we're going to see quite a lot of terror before we see the beauty, but I think we'll see the beauty moving into perspective. And I think one of the beautiful things, I agree, Yosef, is to see the people in Yemen, the people in Baghdad, the people in Egypt, in Cairo, all over the world, people are moving for the Palestinian people. And even if that doesn't have an immediate effect on the governments of those countries, I think we can be assured that that movement is not going to go away, because it's a matter of human justice.
Long live Palestine, free, Arab, dignified. Thanks for watching.